snowflakes fell like shards of crystal, each one catching the pale moonlight as if the world itself were holding its breath. Eleanor Hayes, alone in her small cabin at the edge of the Bitterroot Mountains, was used to the silence. The kind that pressed heavy against the walls, that made the wind seem louder than life itself. She had lived decades in solitude, tending to her fire and her memories, never expecting the extraordinary to pierce the routine of her lonely existence. And then it happened. A soft thud, almost imperceptible over the howl of the storm, echoed at her door. She hesitated, thinking it might be a branch blown loose by the wind. But the next moment, the door shuddered slightly under the weight of something alive, trembling and tiny. She opened it, and there, shivering violently, were two infant Bigfoots, their dark fur plastered to their fragile frames, their wide amber eyes glistening with terror and hope. Their tiny hands reached out, instinctively seeking warmth, and Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She had seen wolves, mountain lions, even bears at the forest's edge. But nothing had prepared her for this. Time seemed to stop as she lifted them into her cabin. Their bodies were frail, trembling like fragile saplings in the storm. But the firelight illuminated a truth that no words could capture. These creatures, whispered of only in legends, had come seeking her care. Eleanor wrapped them in an old quilt, hands shaking, and as they pressed their faces into her lap, she felt something stir in her chest. A pulse of life, of purpose, of miracle. The storm raged outside, but inside, warmth and trust ignited. The wilderness itself had chosen her. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels unawares. In that single miraculous moment, Eleanor understood that life had shifted forever. The cold, dark forest outside no longer felt threatening. It felt alive with unseen guardians, invisible hands that had guided the infants to her door. And though she could not know it yet, this night would mark the beginning of a bond that would defy reason. A connection between human and wild, loneliness and kinship, despair and miracle. The snowstorm, the cold, the isolation, all of it had been a prelude to something extraordinary, something that would warm her soul in ways she had long forgotten. The snowstorm howled like a chorus of lost souls outside Eleanor Hayes' lonely cabin. But what awaited her on that frozen doorstep was not just the wilderness crying out. It was destiny knocking at her door. Two trembling creatures, their tiny bodies shuddering so violently the cold seemed to gnaw through their very bones, stood in the blizzard's cruel breath. They were not wolves, not bears, not anything Eleanor's weathered eyes had ever known in her many decades of solitude. These were infants of a kind spoken of only in whispers. Small beings covered in dark, shaggy fur, with eyes wide and wet like lakes of sorrow, gazing up at her as if pleading for their very souls to be spared. Eleanor, a widow hardened by grief and time, had prepared herself to endure another storm alone. The fire was lit, her shawl wrapped tight, her heart resigned to the silence of her solitude. But the soft thudding at her door broke through the hush, first hesitant, then desperate. And when she opened it, the blast of icy wind carried not only snow, but a miracle that would change her forever. The measure of a soul, her late husband Samuel had once told her, is how it answers the knock at the door. And with that memory pressing against her heart, Eleanor reached trembling hands into the storm, lifting the frail infants from death's doorstep into the fragile sanctuary of her home. And do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels unawares. The cabin, though humble and small, seemed to swell with unseen weight the moment the infants collapsed upon its wooden floor, their tiny frames sinking near the firelight as if surrendering to warmth for the very first time. Eleanor's trembling fingers found the quilt she had stitched long ago from scraps of her old dresses and Samuel's worn shirts, and as she wrapped it around their fragile bodies, she realized she was weaving not just fabric but the threads of her own heart into theirs. Their whimpers rose like prayers, half broken, half hopeful, until one pressed its tiny face into her lap with such desperate trust that tears blurred her sight. She tore bread into fragments, dipped them in honey, and offered them with hands shaking more from awe than age. At first, the little ones sniffed with hesitation. But hunger broke their fear, and they devoured each crumb as if the sweetness itself carried salvation. Eleanor's chest ached with an emotion she had thought long buried with Samuel. The aching joy of being needed. The storm outside raged with fury, battering the shutters like the fists of giants. But within those four walls, a softer storm brewed. The rebirth of a bond between humanity and the wild. Eleanor stayed awake through the long hours of night, watching the glow of fire dance across fur and quilt, listening to the rhythm of their fragile breaths. She should have been afraid of what they were, of what might follow them. Yet she felt only an otherworldly calm, as if the wilderness itself had entrusted her with its most sacred secret. The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, and a little child will lead them. Morning came with a fragile sun, pale light spilling across the Bitterroot Mountains like silver brushed on ice. Eleanor, her weary eyes heavy but her spirit strangely awake, thought perhaps the night had been a dream. But then came the sound. Not the moan of the wind, but the crunch of footsteps in the snow. Not one, not two, dozens. Her blood ran cold as she peered through the frost-glazed window, and there they were. Shadows moving between trees, colossal figures cloaked in fur, their glowing eyes burning like lanterns in the winter haze. She counted, but the numbers blurred. 10, 20, 30. A whole clan circling her tiny cabin. Bigfoots. Real. Alive. Undeniable. Her trembling hands reached instinctively toward Samuel's old rifle above the mantel. But her heart whispered what her mind already knew. It was useless. She was a frail widow, fragile as glass before their massive strength. The infants stirred in the blankets, their soft cries carrying into the silence outside. Then something happened. Something Eleanor would never forget. One figure stepped forward, smaller than the rest, hesitant but purposeful. A child. It approached her door, eyes deep pools of amber. And when Eleanor's shaking hand opened the door, the impossible happened. The creature spoke. The words were rough, like stones dragged across riverbed, but they were words nonetheless. You, help them. The sound hit Eleanor like thunder and grace all at once. Behind the child, 30 pairs of eyes glowed, watching, weighing, deciding. Yet the child's voice carried not threat, but something deeper. Trust. Even the wilderness and desert will be glad in those days. The wasteland will rejoice and blossom with spring crocuses. The clan did not move to harm her. They did not roar or strike. Instead, as if bound by some ancient covenant, they began to withdraw into the trees, one by one, fading into the snow as silently as they had come. Only the child lingered, meeting Eleanor's gaze with an unspoken message that needed no translation. Gratitude. Reverence. A nod, small but eternal in its weight. Before it, too, vanished into the white wilderness. Eleanor closed the door with trembling hands, her knees weak, her breath uneven. She leaned against the wood, tears flooding her eyes as the word pulsed in her chest like a heartbeat. Trust. They had seen her, tested her, judged her heart, and found her worthy. For the first time since Samuel's death, Eleanor felt something more than loneliness, more than survival. She felt chosen, as though the very wilderness had placed its most fragile children into her care. In the days that followed, life became a rhythm unlike any she had ever known. The infants grew stronger with each dawn, their frail bodies filling with warmth, muscle, and spirit. The storm passed, yet inside her heart, a new fire burned, one that no wind could ever put out. The bond she had forged with them was not just survival, not just chance, but miracle. In them, she rediscovered not only her lost tenderness, but also the eternal truth her husband had once whispered, that the measure of a soul is how it answers the knock at the door. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. In that little cabin at the edge of the Bitterroot Mountains, a widow and two orphaned beings from the wilderness found one another in the most unlikely storm. What began with trembling desperation became a bond unbreakable by fear or time. Eleanor, once alone in grief, now shared her fire with lives that had chosen her, and in their survival, she found her own rebirth. A woman in the wild, strangers once, family forever. And so, when the world looks for miracles, they must remember. Sometimes they arrive not with trumpets or angels' wings, but as soft knocks on lonely doors, carried by the storm. No longer trembling shadows of life, the infants had transformed into beings of vibrant curiosity and spirited play, their energy spilling like sunlight into the quiet corners of Eleanor's cabin. Each day became a choreography of discovery and wonder, the tiny explorers navigating the worn wooden floorboards with a boldness that belied their fragile beginnings. Eleanor watched, heart swelling, as one tumbled headfirst into a basket of kindling, scattering sticks in a clatter that might have been chaos for anyone else, but became for her an orchestra of laughter. The other tugged persistently at the fringe of her shawl, insistent in its playful attention, coaxing peals of mirth from her lips she had long forgotten. It was laughter she had not heard in years, bright and unrestrained, spilling from a heart she had thought sealed by grief. In that sound, Eleanor realized that life itself had returned to her home. Small footsteps padding across the floor like the rhythm of a new heartbeat, squeals and chirps filling the air with joy that rivaled the crackling fire. Where the wind's moan had once dominated her cabin, now the music of living creatures, curious, unafraid, and innocent, echoed against the rafters. A righteous man cares for the needs of his animal, but the kindest acts of the wicked are cruel. And then, as if the forest itself acknowledged the covenant she had formed, the others began to return. Their approach carried no threat, no hasty rush to claim what she had protected. Instead, they came with quiet reverence, arriving in twos and threes, respecting the fragile trust that Eleanor had nurtured. They never crossed the threshold unbidden, nor did they intrude upon her space without permission. Their massive forms lingered at the edge of her clearing, half concealed by the shadows of towering pines. Like living sculptures breathing with patience, eyes glimmered faintly in the twilight, reflecting the warm firelight spilling from her cabin windows. The enormity of their presence never threatened her. It conveyed protection, patience, and understanding. On some mornings, they left gifts, tokens from the wild that spoke with clarity no human words could ever achieve. A freshly caught feather laid neatly on a flat stone, a cluster of wild berries wrapped in leaves, or once, astonishingly, a hand-carved piece of wood shaped into a bird, wings etched with deliberate care. Eleanor would stand in awe, holding these treasures to her chest, overwhelmed by the silent generosity of creatures she had once thought legends. And on nights when the wind screamed across the valley and shadows of the forest seemed alive with unseen threats, she could feel the pulse of safety radiating from them. A shield woven from trust, respect, and the quiet knowledge that she was not alone. The Lord God placed the man in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. All creatures are under our care, and through mercy, we honor their lives. Eleanor's connection with the forest grew deeper with every day, every shared glance, every unspoken conversation. When she chopped wood, she caught glimpses of enormous silhouettes in the distance, eyes tracking her movements with steady attention. When she fetched water from the stream, she felt an unseen gentleness in the forest, a protection so subtle that even the wolves' howls carried no fear. Slowly, what had once seemed extraordinary became natural. Her whispers, once trembling with uncertainty, grew firm and warm. She spoke aloud of small victories and mundane struggles. The dwindling woodpile, frost-bitten fingers, the silvery glow of moonlight on snow. She spoke of Samuel, her beloved husband, whose memory lingered in the curves of the cabin walls and the scent of aged pine. As dusk painted the valley in muted gold and purple, Eleanor sat on her porch, shawl wrapped around her frail shoulders. The two infants nestled against her like living hearts. The smoke from her hearth twisted skyward, blending with the fading light, while the pines stood sentinel around her. Her voice carried stories of past winters survived, of gardens tended and songs sung off-key, and though she could not know if her words reached them, a low hum often replied. Not the wind, not an animal call, but a deep resonant sound, as old as the earth itself, thrumming through her bones. It was an answer not in syllables, but in presence. She was heard. She was seen. She was no longer alone. The wolf and the lamb will feed together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. Harmony exists when care is mutual. As winter surrendered to spring, life returned to the valley in splashes of green and gold. Snowmelt cascaded down slopes, filling the air with the laughter of streams. The forest floor, once blanketed in silent white, bloomed with wildflowers, delicate bursts of color that seemed to mirror the joy in Eleanor's heart. Birds returned, their calls ringing through the pines, heralding the revival of a world once muted by snow. The infants, now strong and confident, explored with abandon, clambering across porches, tugging at skirts, rolling and tumbling in playful tussles that drew laughter from Eleanor until tears streamed freely. For the first time in decades, joy had replaced sorrow, lightness had replaced the heavy shadow of solitude, and the presence of the clan, patient and watchful beyond the tree line, was a constant, reassuring rhythm in her life. Shadows flickered between pines, footprints pressed silently into soft earth, and the quiet knowledge that eyes watched over her home provided a deep, abiding peace, patience, restraint, and respect. The forest had taught her the meaning of coexistence, of trust forged between species, of bonds that required no words but lived in acts of care. A righteous person regards the life of all creatures. Mercy and empathy flow in every gesture toward the innocent. Their world had become intertwined. Eleanor and the infants, humans and forest spirits, moved together in a rhythm of trust, laughter, and shared wonder. The cabin was no longer merely a shelter. It was a sanctuary where the wild met the human heart in quiet communion. Life, once distant and untouchable, now pressed close, warm and breathing. And Eleanor, whose days had once been measured by loss, now counted them in giggles, in the thrum of small feet, in the flicker of amber eyes beyond the trees. The forest had entrusted its children to her care, and she had returned their trust tenfold. In the gentle sway of pines, in the ripple of streams, in the quiet hum of the clan's watchful presence, she understood the truest miracle. Life and love and trust could bridge even the vastest chasm between human and wild. The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it. By nurturing the innocent, we honor creation and all its children. They were guardians, yes, but in a way Eleanor could never have imagined. They were kin. The forest itself had adopted her. Every shadow between the pines, every glimmer of amber eyes beyond the snow, whispered a silent promise. She was no longer alone, and yet, even in the warmth of the fire, she questioned the reality of it all. In the quiet hours of night, when the wind pressed against her cabin like the breath of the mountains themselves, Eleanor would sit, hands wrapped around a mug of barely warm tea, and wonder if her mind had finally bowed beneath grief and solitude. What would anyone say if she told them? The townsfolk, who nodded politely but never lingered, would laugh, shake their heads, whisper of loneliness and old age, dismissing her visions as idle fancy. Doctors might prescribe pills to soothe imagined delusions. Priests might counsel her to faith or meditation, but none would understand the profound truth of her heart. They would call it fantasy, perhaps even fear it. And yet, all doubt faded when she looked into the eyes of the infants, the depth in their gaze far beyond human comprehension, mirrors of a soul untouched by lies or pretense. When their tiny furred hands clutched her sleeve, or their small bodies curled against her for warmth, Eleanor felt a certainty she had never known. This was no illusion. The righteous care for the lives of all creatures. In tending to the smallest, they honor the heart of creation. On certain evenings, when the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened across the valley, the Bigfoot child returned. Older than the infants, yet still unmistakably young, he emerged from the tree line with a quiet gravity that spoke of wisdom beyond years. He stepped forward, massive and deliberate, placing a hand, impossibly large yet gentle, upon Eleanor's shoulder. No words were needed. The weight of acknowledgement, the force of belonging, radiated through that simple touch. In that moment, every fear, every lingering question dissolved. The touch of a being so immense, so alive, so deliberate, carried the resonance of truth. No dream, no ghost, no phantom conjured by isolation could match it. Her chest filled with a warmth she had long thought buried beneath decades of loss, years of solitude, of nights stretching endlessly across the Bitterroot Mountains, had carved hollows in her heart that no memory could fill. She had whispered into the void, confided to trees and wind, to ghosts of the past, because no living being had remained to hear. She woke each morning to the stove's sputter, went through her daily labors alone, and closed her eyes each night without a voice to call her name. Now the forest spoke back, not in words, but in presence, not in signs, but in trust. And that presence was more alive, more real than anything she had ever known. Even the wilderness will rejoice, and the desert will blossom. Life responds to care, and the heart is never left unguarded. It had begun with 2 shivering infants, and step by cautious step, the world of myth had unfolded before her. Their kin came next, cautious, immense, a mixture of mystery and gentleness, until the line between her solitude and their wild domain blurred completely. Seasons shifted, and with each passing snowfall, the forest left silent traces of its presence. Footprints encircling her cabin, shadows lingering just beyond the reach of firelight, the occasional offering of polished stones or carefully woven branches left upon her porch. Sometimes she would read aloud from her old books, her voice trembling at first, and watch as they tilted their great heads as if each word mattered. She told them of her youth, of her late husband, of the wider world beyond the ridges. They never replied in human tongue, yet their presence was answer enough, a language of patience, of trust, of kinship forged in silence. Each act of care, each simple meal offered, each shared warmth by the hearth had built a bridge no human could see. Eleanor had opened her door, and in doing so, had opened a passageway into her own heart, one that the forest, in its patient, eternal way, had crossed to meet her. Whoever is kind to the little ones, to the creatures of earth, lends mercy to the world. For in each act of care, the divine breath is felt. And so, the years passed like gentle tides, with the infants growing bold and strong, the Bigfoot child appearing now and then to reaffirm their bond, and the forest around her transforming from a wilderness of fear to a sanctuary of kinship. Eleanor Hayes, once a forgotten widow in the Bitterroot Mountains, now lived with a secret more precious than any treasure. 30 guardians, patient and eternal, watching over her home. They moved like shadows and light, present in form and spirit, their gifts of berries, feathers and carved wood a quiet testament to the bond they shared. They listened when she laughed, when she read, when she spoke of Samuel, and though no human witness would ever believe her, she carried it proudly, in every fiber of her being. The world outside might call her a dreamer, a lonely widow, perhaps even unwell. But inside the cabin, among firelight and fur, she knew the truth. The wilderness had chosen her. She had earned its trust. She had earned its love. She had earned her place among the guardians. And in that knowledge, Eleanor finally understood a joy she had never imagined. A connection that spanned species, seasons, and the boundaries of belief. The Lord God made all creatures. Those who care for them discover the divine in every heartbeat, every breath, every glance. The storm that had first brought the infants to her doorstep was now a distant memory. In its place was warmth, laughter, and companionship beyond imagination. Eleanor, once alone, now had a life interwoven with the pulse of the wild. Their shadows lingered at the tree line. Their eyes glimmered in twilight, and the faintest hum, a song older than memory, rose from the pines like a heartbeat she could feel in her chest. She had opened her door on a winter night, trembling with uncertainty, and in return the forest had opened its heart. Not a phantom, not a myth, not a fleeting dream, but a living, breathing bond of trust, care, and love. Eleanor Hayes was no longer merely surviving. She was home, and the world beyond the mountains might never know. But inside her cabin, by firelight, with 30 guardians keeping vigil, she had discovered a miracle older and truer than any legend. She had discovered family, not bound by blood, but by heart. The years had passed, But the memory of that first miraculous night never left Eleanor Hayes. The 2 infants she had sheltered had grown strong, their fur thick and glistening in the sunlight, their curiosity boundless, their laughter echoing through the cabin like music the mountains themselves might hum. The forest had fully revealed itself to her, not as a place of danger, but as a sanctuary of connection. A realm where trust, kindness, and care transcended words. Eleanor had become more than a widow living alone. She had become a guardian in her own right. A mother to creatures that the world called myth. A friend to beings whose eyes held the wisdom of centuries. Evenings were now her favorite time. Wrapped in her worn shawl, she sat on the porch as the infants tumbled around her, chasing shadows, wrestling with joy, squealing in delight. And beyond the tree line, the clan remained. Their presence was constant, subtle, protective. Occasionally, the Bigfoot child appeared, massive hand resting on her shoulder, a silent affirmation that she was seen, that she was loved, that she had earned a place in a world larger than human imagination. Words were not necessary. Trust, care, and love spoke in every glance, every gesture, every heartbeat shared between them. Eleanor's heart, once hollow with years of solitude, was now overflowing. She understood a truth the townsfolk could never grasp. Family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes it is defined by courage, by compassion, by opening one's heart when the world seems frozen and cruel. The forest whispered its own quiet songs at night. The gentle rustle of pines, the distant call of a bird, the soft hum that rose from unseen presences. All of it reminded Eleanor that she had been chosen. The storm that had first brought the infants to her door had become a legend in her own heart, a testament to the miracles that happen when one answers the knock at the threshold, when one offers warmth and care to those in need, when one dares to trust the impossible. And as she gazed into the amber eyes of the now grown infants, the same eyes that had once pleaded for mercy, she felt a deep, unshakable joy. Eleanor Hayes, once alone in the Bitterroot Mountains, now lived surrounded by life, by love, and by a secret so profound it could never be fully explained, only felt. The Bigfoots, 30 strong, moved through the forest like living shadows, guardians and companions, silent yet steadfast, offering protection, presence, and the ultimate gift, belonging. She had opened her door to 2 trembling infants, and in return, the wild had opened its heart to her. The cabin, once a place of isolation, had become a home, not just for her, but for a family she had never imagined. And in the stillness of a snow-dusted morning, as sunlight kissed the valley and life stirred in every corner of the forest, Eleanor whispered softly to the wind, to the fire, to the unseen eyes that watched her always. Thank you for trusting me, for choosing me, for letting me be part of your world. And for the first time in decades, she felt a peace so deep it filled every corner of her soul. The miracle had come, not just in the survival of 2 tiny creatures, but in the quiet revelation that love, trust, and compassion could bridge even the greatest divides between species, between worlds, between hearts. Eleanor smiled, the cabin alive with laughter, the forest alive with guardians, and her heart alive with joy. She was never alone again. The righteous care for the lives of all creatures. In their kindness, the miracle of connection is revealed, and hearts once broken are made whole.